All right. Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us for OSFI's media briefing on the domestic stability buffer. Bonjour et merci de vous joindre à nous pour ce point de presse concernant le taux de la réserve pour stabilité intérieure. Mon nom est Christina Casper de la Division des communications, and I will moderate today's briefing. Superintendent Routledge will lead us through the announcement. He will deliver opening remarks and will then answer your questions. He is joined by Angie Radiskovic, OSFI's Deputy Superintendent, Risk, Strategy, and Policy. So just before we begin, this session is available to listen to in the official language of your choice, thanks to our interpreters. Pour commencer, je tiens à préciser que vous pouvez suivre ce point de presse dans la langue officielle de votre choix. To enable simultaneous interpretation, please click on the interpretation button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Pour accéder à l'interprétation simultanée, cliquez sur le bouton situé dans le bas de votre fenêtre Zoom. If you select English, you will hear interpretation in English for any French spoken. If you do not want to hear any interpretation, no action is required. Encore, si vous sélectionnez français, vous entendrez l'interprétation en français de tout ce qui est dit en anglais. Et si vous n'avez pas besoin d'interprétation, vous n'avez rien à faire. And now, over to you, Superintendent, for your opening remarks.
Thank you, Christina. Bonjour tout le monde. Thanks everyone for joining. Welcome to our June 2025 rate setting announcement for the Domestic Stability Buffer, or DSB. I'd like to start by acknowledging that I'm speaking to you from Ottawa on land that has long served as a meeting place amongst Indigenous peoples, including the Algonquin Anishinaabe people, and I'm grateful to be present on this territory. The Domestic Stability Buffer applies to Canada's 6 largest or systemically important banks. It requires these banks to set aside capital so that it is available for use during periods of stress. It is a usable buffer intended to be built up during periods of growth and released as risks materialize. OSFI has decided to maintain the Domestic Stability Buffer at its current level of 3.5%. Our next announcement will occur in December 2025. Today's decision recognizes that financial system vulnerabilities remain elevated yet stable. The uncertainty caused by rising trade disputes has not manifested itself in indicators of financial system stress. And we at OSFI remain alert and attentive to financial system stress with a willingness to act with urgency when necessary. Fortunately, Canada's systemically important banks have entered this period of uncertainty from a position of strength, thanks to the strong capital buffers they have fortified in recent years. Since our last announcement in December, some vulnerabilities have eased modestly. For example, Canadian household indebtedness has lessened, although it remains elevated by historic standards. Many Canadian homeowners will renew their mortgages over the next 18 months. Falling mortgage rates will moderate the potential financial stress from renewals if rates remain at today's level. Nevertheless, we expect that borrowers will renew at higher mortgage rates than prevailed in the 2020 through 2021 period, a fact that will intensify financial pressure on those carrying higher debt levels relative to income. Though stable, commercial real estate vulnerabilities remain elevated as collateral valuations remain under pressure. We continue to assess potential impacts that a global trade conflict could have on the Canadian economy, with a special focus on spillovers to the financial system. We remain ready to respond should conditions change. Since the global financial crisis, OSFI has worked to build up resilience in Canada's financial system. This work has included increasing the DSB to 3.5%, just below its upper limit of 4%. We also observe that Canada's largest banks have remained profitable despite the challenges in the risk environment. As of April 30, 2025, their CET1 capital ratios were 13.6% on average, up almost 30 basis points over the past 6 months, and are now more than 200 basis points above the DSB on average. Et maintenant, un résumé en français. La réserve pour stabilité intérieure, ou RSI, oblige les 6 grandes banques canadiennes à créer une réserve de fonds propres pour faire face à des tensions. Ce mois de juin nous avons décidé de maintenir le taux de la réserve pour stabilité intérieure à 3,5%. Cette décision a été prise parce que les vulnérabilités du système financier sont élevées, mais stables. L'endettement des ménages s'est légèrement amélioré, mais les tensions financières pourraient augmenter si les prêts hypothécaires sont renouvelés à des taux plus élevés. Le secteur d'immobilier commercial reste aussi vulnérable. À noter que les banques canadiennes sont bien capitalisées et rentables. En moyenne, leur ratio CET1 est à 13,6%, soit plus de 200 points de baisse au-dessus du taux de la RSI. Using capital buffers is a sign of a healthy financial system. At times, the release of the DSB can come after a sudden and severe shock that impacts the financial system. Recall OSFI lowered the DSB by 125 basis points in March 2020 in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. And in other situations, OSFI could adjust the DSB in response to less severe materialization of risk. In either case, lowering the DSB enables banks to absorb both losses and intensifying balance sheet risk while maintaining the critical services they provide to the nation's economy. Given the unusual degree of economic uncertainty at present, OSFI stands ready to lower our capital expectations of Canada's systemically important banks as financial conditions warrant. Doing so would signal the exceptional banking system resilience built up since the global financial crisis of 2008 through 2009. And any future decision by OSFI to lower the DSB would be a signal of the underlying strengths of the banking system, strengths necessary to manage through periods of economic stress. Indeed, the domestic stability buffer represents the capital reserves at Canada's systemically important banks that we believe are necessary to absorb stress scenarios if risks crystallize. Et maintenant en français. La RSI représente les réserves que nous jugeons nécessaires pour traverser des périodes d'incertitude lorsqu'elles surviennent. Le taux de la RSI peut être réduit à la suite d'un choc soudain, comme nous l'avons fait en mars 2020 pendant la pandémie. Dans d'autres cas, nous pourrions l'ajuster en cas de matérialisation moins grave d'un risque. Nous demeurons prêts à réduire le taux de la RSI si les conditions financières venaient à le justifier. Et ceci peut être fait à n'importe quel moment. Thank you, and I'll turn it back to Christina for questions.
Okay, merci, Surintendant. Please note that the remarks have been posted to OSFI's website in English et en français ce matin. All right, so a few notes before we go to questions. This event is for registered media only. A reminder that OSFI officials cannot speak to today's impact of the announcement today on specific institutions. We'll do one question and one follow-up. Please, une question et un suivi, s'il vous plaît. So if you want to ask a question, please raise your virtual hand using the Zoom React button at the bottom of your screen, and I'll call on you to ask your question. Veuillez lever votre main virtuelle en utilisant le bouton de réaction Zoom au bas de l'écran et je vous nommerai pour poser votre question. Et encore, vous pouvez poser votre question dans la langue officielle de votre choix. All right, so I'm seeing a few hands. We'll start with Nivedita. Over to you.
Hi, good morning. Thank you for taking my question. I want to ask about the tensions in the Middle East and how you're factoring in what's going on there and the impact it could have on the energy market or the global economy while setting the DSB or any other changes or things that the bank should consider to stay stable at this time.
Yeah, thanks, Nivedita. Like we've seen over a number of years, certainly the last few years, geopolitics produce tensions in various regions of the world, and those tensions can manifest themselves into broader disruptions in financial markets. While the tensions in the Middle East remain of serious concern to us, both as Canadians, because we know some Canadians are there now and we're concerned about them. The market and financial markets are absorbing that stress for now, and that's encouraging. If markets react more severely, based on what we've seen over the last number of years, we think Canadian banks be able to absorb and adapt to unexpected and significant market movements. They're very liquid. They have abundant capital, well above even our domestic stability buffer. So in our view, there's plenty of resilience to absorb a more significant shock in financial markets caused by geopolitical tensions or perhaps something else.
All right, thank you.
All right, thank you. Next, we'll go to Stephanie Marotta with the Globe and Mail. Stephanie, over to you.
Hi, Peter. Good to see you. Thank you for taking
Hi,
our
Stephanie.
questions. So first, you had mentioned that you're assessing the potential impacts of global trade and that you have a special focus on spillovers to the financial system. So what types of specific spillovers are you focused on and monitoring for?
What a material weakening in the Canadian economy would mean for the banking system. So what would happen to credit losses? Would there be any market-related losses? And you try and incorporate those assumptions into stress scenario, and when you're running stress scenarios, you're testing the resilience of capital and liquidity ratios through those scenarios. A great example was published recently by the Bank of Canada in their financial stability report, and in it they gave a preview of a macro stress test run by the IMF as part of their regular supervisory assessment of Canada's financial system. And in that analysis, which is a fairly severe recession and a fairly severe housing market correction, the average CET1 capital ratio, the one we set the DSB against, falls from current levels down to about 10.5%. And that is, and if you're down at that 10.5% trough, that's still a very strong and well-capitalized bank. So, in our own stress tests, which are more institution specific, we're getting similar results. The buffer we built will prove to be very resilient to a stress scenario. Now, we're not predicting a stress scenario, but that's what we test, and that's what we set the buffer against.
Then one follow-up, sort of on that higher buffer that you're maintaining. You had noted that banks have remained profitable despite the challenging risk environment, but there's still concerns that the much higher capital requirements hurt global competitiveness and eat into profit. So what do you say to these concerns at maintaining such a higher level?
A few things. First, on the global competitiveness issue, we did address that earlier this year by delaying further increases in the standardized capital floor. Or put differently, we've paused our implementation of the 2017 Basel III reforms, waiting for our peer regulators to catch up. And so that's sort of our response to reasonable concerns about global level playing field. The DSB is really a resilience buffer, and we don't set that giving any consideration to competitive issues. We set it giving consideration to what the impacts of a stress scenario would have on the balance sheets of banks. And to give you kind of a sense of how our current capital levels of Canadian systemically important banks compare to their peers internationally, and let's contain that peer group to globally systemically important banks. The median CET1 ratio for globally systemically important banks is 13.4%, based on recent data. That's about the Canadian bank median. So our capital rules relative to our peer regulators are about at the median. Now we have a very profitable banking system, and so that adds to the resilience for our institutions. But we're not way off sides in terms of our resiliency buffers.
Thank you, Peter.
Thank you for your question, Stephanie. Next, we'll go to Emile Look with the Logic. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Does OSFI have any financial stability concerns related to the U.S. paving the way for banks and other companies to issue stablecoins?
That's a great question, Amy. Stablecoins represents an important innovation in financial services. And our friends south of the border are putting together a legislative framework to enable their issuance by regulated banks and by other players. And we look forward to, and we know there is work underway currently to develop a legislative framework so that we have, so that our system keeps up with the innovation both in the United States and in other countries. And when that legislation is completed, we'll be able to explain how we might play a role, if so assigned, in overseeing stablecoin issuances. The stablecoin product itself is effectively in design an overnight liability issued by a legal entity. We regulate those entities every day. They're called banks. Or credit unions or trust companies. And so we're quite prepared with the right legislative framework to regulate and supervise that particular innovation I think in a constructive way.
Thanks, Peter.
Do you have a follow-up question?
No, thank you so much.
Okay, perfect. Thanks again. Next, we'll go to Christine Dobby with Bloomberg. Over to you.
Good morning. Thanks for taking the questions. I wanted to ask you about the issue of trade and tariffs, and the fact that you haven't seen it manifest in intense indicators of financial system stress. I know this is something you're watching closely. Have you been surprised not to see more of an impact?
Surprised. I've been gratified. And I think the Bank of Canada put it best in their last interest rate announcement. The Canadian economy is softer, but not sharply weaker. We were certainly stress testing more severe scenarios, and we were quite comfortable with the DSB that we had earlier in the year. And so I think it's fair to say our planning assumption was a more severe outcome than what we actually saw. That's not a prediction. It was just a planning assumption that you take in order to make sure what you're doing and where your buffers are is reasonable and appropriate. But I think it's fair to say that conditions thus far, as of June 26, 2025, are better than our planning assumption back earlier in the year. We take only a very, very moderate amount of comfort from that, and we remain focused on downside scenarios. We like the amount of resilience in the financial system, certainly with the DSB buffer, but we also have pretty good resilience in liquidity. And so we are, we view the Canadian banking system as well positioned to absorb a deterioration in conditions if they occur. We hope they don't occur, but if they do, we think the Canadian banking system will absorb that deterioration and continue to provide lending and other financial services to Canadians in a prudent and confident way.
Thanks. That's helpful. I guess sort of related, you talked about being prepared to respond swiftly to lower the DSB if needed. Can you talk about what kinds of circumstances would prompt that?
You're hearkening back to the reference I made to the Bank of Canada's recent financial stability report. If we saw a sudden deterioration in the economy that looked and was a significant recession, where you saw an uptick in employment, where you saw a significant housing correction downwards, equity market correction downwards, those would be conditions. Those would represent to us materialization in these risk vulnerabilities, and we would aim to act urgently, and early in that. We would have to see empirical evidence of it. We would not do that, with the assumption or forecast that was going to occur. We would be looking for empirical evidence. Then once we had the empirical evidence, we think it's our responsibility to act with urgency.
Thank you. I have a question on a different topic, but I can wait and re-queue if.
That's okay, Christine. I'm not seeing any other raised hands. Go for it.
Okay. I wanted to just ask you a bit about the mortgage market. Obviously, the big six tend to lend to customers with fairly strong credit ratings. I wonder if you have any concerns about stress in the broader mortgage market at this time. We're obviously hearing a lot about some weaknesses with pre-construction, condos, those kinds of things.
We're never not concerned about housing market, but let me try and frame it a little bit. Across the institutions we regulate, you have a variety of business models. For the systemically important banks, those are broad-based universal business models. And then we have challenger institutions that have specific niches that they target markets that they target. And they do provide vital services to Canadians that want to borrow to own a home. In the course of regulating those institutions or supervising them, we try and understand what their business model is. We try and understand what risk concentrations they're susceptible to, and then we try and set our supervisory standards against those risk concentrations. Another word for that is proportionality. And so that process gives us pretty good view into how risk concentrations might vary across institutions, and then our supervisors can adjust the amount of resilience individually we ask for at banks to account for that. So, our own sort of institution-specific stress testing helps us get there. And so, even though, like the domestic stability buffer, that's a public capital buffer that we announce every 6 months. There's another capital buffer. We call it Pillar 2. It is specific to institutions and it is private. But we do use that Pillar 2 buffer tool where we see concentrations. And generally speaking, that process gets us to a position where we can say with comfort, when we stress test our institutions, we think there's capital there to absorb a sudden deterioration in the economy, so that stress in the financial system is lessened, and the system overall can lend through that stress. That's our goal. And it's certainly systemically important banks are central to that, and we also look at other institutions.
Thanks. That's really helpful. And you're feeling good about how those other institutions are doing at this point? Or maybe you can't
judge that there's a lot of resilience. We judge
Yeah.
that there's a lot of resilience, and it would take a very, very severe stress to exhaust that resilience. And the probability of that occurring is quite low. It's not zero. We never rest and think that it is zero, but the probability is quite low.
Thanks very much.
All right. We've got another question from Emile from the Logic. Please go ahead.
Thank you. Peter, I just had one more question on stablecoins. What would the right legislative framework look like, and who is doing the work on this? So like when it comes to banks or big tech, who should or shouldn't be able to issue stablecoins?
Oh, it's a policy question. And I think my colleagues at the Department of Finance are the ones that should answer that. And as the deputy head of the regulator, I don't want to publicly give them advice on that. I think the Genius Act in the United States is a pretty interesting document. It's worth a good read. And in fact, I know that my colleagues at the Department of Finance are intimately familiar with it. And I look forward to a made in Canada sensible solution to this.
Thank you. So just to confirm, it's the Department of Finance that's dealing with the...
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, the Minister of Finance and the government, and supported by the Department of Finance, develop financial sector policy. And then they may or may not seek our advice. Usually they do on financial sector policy issues. It's their discretion, though. And then when it's finished, they hand it to us and we make it work. That's our job.
Great. Thank you.
All right. Well, I'll give it another second here if you want to ask a question. Okay, I'm not seeing any other questions, so we'll conclude today's briefing. Si vous avez des questions supplémentaires, n'hésitez pas à communiquer avec notre équipe des relations médias. If you have any additional questions, please reach out to OSFI Media Relations. Thanks everyone for attending. Passez une super bonne journée. Au revoir.
Je vous remercie.